We forget that fiat currency is nothing but a thought abstraction. That's all it is.
Yep.
And the only thing that gives it value is that we believe it has value. Once we stop believing, it has no value whatsoever.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Peak Prosperity podcast. I'm your host, Chris Martinson. I'm so excited for today's guest. We had one talk earlier. You can find an earlier beginning of this talk on his channel, but I feel like I've already made a new best friend because we're just aligned on so many things. I'm going to welcome to the show here, George Gammon. George, hey, it's so great to have you here.
Chris, thanks for having me. That was a fantastic conversation we just had, and I can't wait to dive in deeper and talk about some things that will hopefully provide a lot of value to people and increase their wealth and financial freedom and personal liberty. It's what we're all about.
Absolutely. So a lot of people on my side are probably going, who's George? Even though you came on like gangbusters, but I'm looking here now, June 25th, 2019 is the first YouTube video I can find that you've got, and it's on a Medellin remodel project in an art. It's got 2,200 views and 22, and you just came roaring out of the gate. Tell us about your progression here as on YouTube, and tell people who you are.
Well, I retired in 2012. I was an entrepreneur for many years, and when I did, I knew absolutely nothing about investing or economics. I didn't know what a yield curve was. I didn't know what the Fed was. I just had no clue. So I was in Singapore, actually. I had about 10 minutes to blow before a dinner date at the Marina Bay Sands, and I stumbled across Milton Friedman's series, Free to Choose, on YouTube, and that took me right down the rabbit hole. And I went from him to Thomas Sowell, who now is my favorite economist. And then I started studying some of the investing greats like Buffett and Jim Rogers. I really resonated with everything that he was saying, and Doug Casey and Rick Rule and Peter Schiff. And so I knew that, okay, I need to figure this stuff out because I've got a little bit of savings, but I don't have enough to just ride it out for the rest of my life if I want to maintain my current lifestyle without getting a little bit of a return. So I really started to get in the weeds, and I liked Jim Rogers' approach, where he would go into kind of the things that people hated and obscure countries, and he'd buy things when they're cheap and sell them when they're expensive. And at the time I was in the United States, and I was looking at a chart of housing going back to 1900 adjusted for inflation. And of course, most people don't know this, but housing in the United States was pretty much flat for the first 100 years, from 1900 all the way to 2000, when you adjust for size and inflation. And then, of course, in the early 2000s, we know what happened. It just goes straight up, parabolic, and then it comes crashing down to where it was on its historic trend line in 2012. Now, back then, everyone thought that housing would just continue to go down forever, that we were going to have a Japan type scenario. But I looked at Japan and I saw that from their peak to trough, they went down by about 60%. And at the time we were down by about 50. So I thought, okay, well, real estate might be cheap and I want to be like Jim Rogers. So I might as well just take all my money and buy real estate. So I had to figure that out. I did that in the Midwest in Kansas City, and I enjoyed it. But as an entrepreneur, I made quite a bit of money outside the United States. So after I learned the real estate game here, I just took it overseas and started investing in South America, and more specifically in Medellin, Colombia in 2015, because I wanted to go long oil. That was back the last time it got under $30 a barrel, but I had no clue how to do that. And I had only been studying economics and investing for a couple of years at that point. And I'm like, well, okay, the Colombian peso is kind of loosely tied to oil. So maybe I could buy an asset that's denominated in pesos to actually go long oil. And I thought, well, the only thing I know is real estate. So I'll buy some real estate denominated in pesos and take the skill set from that area and apply it to, kind of this macro thesis I have. And then maybe I can get a double whammy. Maybe I can build some equity through the remodel process, and I can get paid positive cash flow to wait. And then maybe if I get a pop on the currency because oil goes back up, I'll make money on both sides. And then if I don't, if it goes against me, at least I'll have that forced appreciation to kind of hedge my downside. And so I went into real estate in 2015 in Medellin, Colombia. I got very aggressive. I now have an actual team there that does this for me full time. But in early 2019, we were remodeling all of these properties. And I knew how popular the shows were in the United States, these HG TV shows. And I thought, well, I'm doing this anyway. Why on earth don't we just get a film crew and we'll do a TV show here in Medellin, Colombia? I'm sure it would be wildly popular in Spanish as well. So I went and pitched the local TV station. And this is a great story for all of the aspiring entrepreneurs out there, that at some point you've just got to shoot first and ask questions later, because remember, I don't speak Spanish at this time. I know enough to get by at like taxis and restaurants, but by not even close to be, the center of a Spanish speaking TV show. And, how are you going to, I knew nothing about producing a show. So the TV station said, okay, we like the idea. If you produce it, we'll put it on air and then we'll split commercial profits. I said, sure, sounds good. Now, again, I had no clue how to do it. So in about 3 weeks' time, I had to figure out how to produce a professional reality TV show, additionally hire all of the workers. So we did that. We had the first season. It was called Vida en Remodelación. So this is the process that I absolutely hate. I love the remodel. I love buying. I love investing in real estate. But as far as the paperwork and dealing with the lawyers and the notary and the accountants, I absolutely hate this part. And it was really popular. We had a great time. But then after the first season, there was a bit of a break between when we were going to do the second season. And I wanted to keep my staff employed because they were fantastic. So we started the YouTube channel. And initially it was about real estate. And we had no whiteboard videos. We were just trying to do all these crazy videos and crazy edits to see what worked. And I didn't think anyone in their right mind would want to watch a video on macro, but that was my passion. I mean, I really enjoyed real estate investing, but if you get me at the dinner table, the conversation is always going to go back to macroeconomics. That's what I'm really, really passionate about. So the the real estate videos weren't really popular. I was getting a couple views here and there from family members, basically. But once I started doing the videos on macro, for whatever reason, those were the ones that took off, and the rest is history.
Well, in a great history, even if it's just a year old, and you're just on a great track with it. And I love the quality of your videos, especially the whiteboard videos. But they say ignorance is bliss. You fell down the rabbit hole. Any regrets?
Oh, no. No, this has been, as far as the YouTube channel or my journey into macroeconomics, it's been life-changing. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. I mean, now, as an example, I have the opportunity to talk to people like you and our good buddy Mike Maloney and all these people that I've been learning from since 2012. And I mean, it's like a dream come true. Every single morning I wake up and do another interview. It's like a kid in a candy store. I actually get to ask my own questions that I have in the back of my head to these professionals out there. And it really helps me see the world more clearly. And I just try to take what I learn from the Rebel Capitalist show in my interviews and kind of put them into a whiteboard format, so everyone that watches the channel can understand, hopefully, as much or if not more than I do about the world around them and make better financial decisions.
Yeah, I'll tell you, my similar arc to my story. I'm just sort of doing what I do in life and pretty successful at it. And then it was summer vacation. It was 2002. And I read Creature from Jekyll Island by Edward Griffin, right? And this is kind of early internet. So it isn't as well collated as it is today. And I'm just yelling out, paragraphs to somebody who has no interest in hearing this stuff over summer vacation, because it was just, I couldn't believe it. Like, I got a PhD, got the MBA. They taught me how to compete for money, but they never told me how the stadium was made. And here's G. Edwards saying, here's how banking works. I'm like, that can't be true. I would have learned this. That's how it works. And of course, it's all completely true. So I remember that really like having a comfortable blanket ripped off of me, and that began a very long period of inquiry, which leads to us having this conversation. But I found probably one of the most difficult parts is intellectually this stuff isn't hard, but emotionally it's kind of weird to think, why has this stuff not been taught? And I felt maybe the same thing you do. So let me ask you the question: do you feel like it's sort of like, what's your intention behind teaching people these things?
I just got to get it off my chest.
Yeah.
I mean, that it drives me crazy, Chris. I'm, now when I see something on Twitter, or prior to seeing something on like CNBC or hearing a podcast, I just keep obsessing about it and thinking about it. I'm like, I've got to get this off my chest. I've got to tell people what's going on. And that's really the genesis of a lot of my whiteboard videos. It's just me trying to get this stuff off my chest so I don't drive myself crazy. But, going back to G. Edward, such an awesome guy, and I had the opportunity to meet him out at Jekyll Island. He invited me out there to speak a couple months ago at the Red Pill Expo that was on Jekyll Island. So that was just another example of an experience I've had as a result of starting this YouTube channel that you just can't put a price tag on.
He's an amazing individual, and not showing his age at all in how he speaks and processes.
Speaking. He was there just managing the whole event, and he had his family out there, and it was really a special opportunity, that's for sure.
At Jekyll Island. That's awesome. So this is a huge topic, and one of your more popular videos of late has been around this thing called the Great Reset, which is really something that's caught my attention, not just because of the audacity of what the Great Reset seeks to do, but because of how powerful the movement is behind it. And I detect that power in this, that various leaders of Canada, the United States, Europe have all been echoing sort of the same verbiage, to the point that the Biden-Harris transition website, its URL is buildbackbetter.gov, not Biden-Harris.gov. Build Back Better, which is a phrase that the Great Reset crowd has been actively coming forward. They believe we need a Great Reset. I'm wondering, what is this reset really all about? Is it just they've calculated there's too much debt, it can't possibly be paid back, so how are we going to egalitarianly sort of divvy up the losses? Or what do you think this is really about at this point?
I think it ranges from the Cantillon effect to communism. So with the Cantillon effect, for those people who don't know, it's basically the people who are closest to the money spigot when it's printed are the people who receive the maximum benefit, because that goes into their pocket and they spend it before consumer prices increase to a level where the additional money supply really doesn't benefit anyone from a standpoint of purchasing power. So if you want to kind of look at the World Economic Forum and the IMF and these people that are pushing this agenda, and you've got to kind of say, okay, what's their motive here? And even if we assume that they have good intentions, you've got to say, okay, well, let's look at the other side of the equation, and let's assume that these people are pursuing their own self-interest, which I think the probabilities are much higher. And then you say, okay, well, if you can destroy an economy, they know that the way that the economy is going to be propped up, let's say, for lack of a better term, is through money printing. And if the political insiders and the financial insiders, or the people at the World Economic Forum, are closest to the central bankers, then they're going to be getting that money. It's going to be going through their pocket and then down to the average Joe if it ever gets there. So I think if you want to put on your tinfoil hat for a moment, that could be one reason why some of them are incentivized to pursue policies that are obvious that they're going to reduce the amount of economic input or output, excuse me. They're not going to increase the amount of economic output. Another thing is they're all central planners. And I think they would openly admit that. They want to move away from what they call neoliberalism, which sounds kind of scary. But if you look at what neoliberalism is, I think most people would be like, okay, that sounds really good to me. I like that a lot. It's basically very small government. It's something that Milton Friedman would have been very aligned with. And it's just kind of free market capitalism, very small government, private property rights. And they want to move away from that. And also, you have to go to their website and read many different blog posts and kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together. You can't just look at one, and then you really get an idea of what this agenda is. And those are their words, not mine. They're calling it the Great Reset agenda. That's not me just trying to be use hyperbole. So if you say, okay, they're central planners, what's the problem? If you and I are trying to come to a conclusion as to how we can create a centrally planned society, and we're being intellectually honest, we're going to say, okay, well, what problems did Russia have? Why did that system collapse? And one of the first things we would come to is they didn't have any price discovery. They didn't have price signals, right? So if you don't have price signals, you can't efficiently allocate scarce resources with alternative uses. And therefore you burn through those resources, and you have a situation where, like, they have the Ukraine as an example that could have provided enough food for 100 Russias, and yet there's famine throughout the entire country. That's because those central planners, it's impossible for them to get the information they need because there's no prices. Where in a free market system, all the individual actors would have those price signals. Therefore, they could make decisions to how to move those resources around to where they are used in the most efficient way possible. You see, so you and I would sit down, we'd come to the conclusion, okay, well, there's no pricing. So how do we solve that problem? If our objective is central planning or communism, if we truly believe that that's the next step for society. And I want to point out, most people don't realize this, that Marxists, and Marx himself didn't see Marxism and capitalism as competing economies or as competing systems. He saw them as, you start with feudalism, then you have to have capitalism, and you have to let capitalism do what it's going to do and what it does well. And that's create technology and industry. And then once you get to something called late stage capitalism, once capitalism has pushed society as far as it possibly can, then you need to have a socialist or communist revolution where they come in and take the means of production away from the capitalists and they distribute it more equally. And then that's what takes society to the next level. That's what increases the wealth of society. If you allow capitalism to just sit there and fester, as they would see it, in this late stage capitalism, it's going to implode in on itself. So now, I'm not saying that's the way they see things, right? Mm-hmm. So they are, if you believe that Marxism is the future and that the problem with Russia is that they just didn't allow capitalism to actually set in the first place. They just went straight from feudalism to communism, and that's why it all crumbled. Then you start putting the pieces of the puzzle together. But back to my point about the central planners, they would recognize that this was a big problem. So what's the solution? Well, what I think could be one of their solutions is to start with a central bank digital currency. Because what happens when you have a central bank digital currency is we would all be required to have an account, a bank account, if you will, or a checking account with the Fed. Or maybe they merge the Fed and the Treasury with MMT. But with the central planning entity, the entity that's printing the money, we would need to have an account, just like the primary dealer banks have an account with the Fed now. And so that would, let's say you just download the app on your phone, and you instantly have this account with the Fed, and that's where they send you your, let's say, monthly stimulus in these Fed coins, $2,000 a month in Fed coins, we'll say. And there you start to collect data, a lot of data in real time, because you would have every single transaction happening across the entire economy, and you'd be getting that data in real time. That's step one. Step two, and if you read the World Economic Forum's website, a lot of their blog posts, you see that they're really into not only artificial intelligence, but they're into this thing where they see us having some sort of computer chip in our, I don't know, in your wrist or who knows where. But this would transmit like your vital signs to the cloud, which would be able to give, let's say, the central planners the information they need to distribute, let's say, healthcare, which is a limited resource with alternative uses. And then if you read more of what their game plan is, let's say, or the way they see the future, this chip would also take your thoughts and your dreams. And again, this is them saying it, not me. And that would also go straight to the cloud. So let's think this through. Now this cloud is getting every single financial transaction occurring in the economy in real time. It's getting everyone's vital statistics, and it's getting everyone's thoughts and their dreams. So think about how much data is coming into this central location. And then you could layer artificial intelligence on top of that. Now, all of a sudden, the artificial intelligence has enough information to be able to allocate those scarce resources, maybe even more efficiently than the free market could with price signals. Now, I'm not saying that it would. That's, again, those aren't George Gammon's words. I don't think that anything will ever beat individuals making their own decisions in a bottoms-up way in a free market capitalist society. But I am saying that if you were a central planner and you were trying to achieve Marxism, and you saw what didn't work in the past, and you see what technology we have today and where we could be in 2030, this is how I think you could put the pieces of the puzzle together, and this is what you could argue for. And again, just if you look at their website and kind of reverse engineer it, they don't say this explicitly, but I think you can kind of connect the dots. If I had, and again, there are no certainties. I don't want people to lose sleep over this. There are only probabilities. But in my mind, if you're trying to attach the highest probable outcome or scenario, that would be, I think, their true intentions.
So many responses to that, and thank you for that really wonderful explanation of what's probably going on. And so, one paraphrasing that sounds like this is just, if we could just improve the crop reports, we'll get it right this time, right? And I'm not a big believer in that. I mean, I understand. I think the pressures. I understand where they're coming from, and I have this other way of looking at it, which is that it's a world of scarce resources, increasingly scarce. If you understand the oil, where we are in the age of oil, the way I do, it would be irresponsible for leaders not to really be thinking about where do we want to be in 10, 20 years in this story and starting to move that puck in there. I get that. The way they're going about it, though, I think is, so let me take just one thread of this. I agree. Price signals are really, really important. I think because of what the central banks have done, they've actually destroyed almost all price signals. And by which I mean they've taken the price of money and they've made it zero. So I don't know what information you get with the price of money at zero. Well, you get a lot of crazy stuff. You get IPOs of companies worth 90 billion who have no revenues and only losses. You get shale operators losing money 10 years in a row as an industry.
Yep.
And that's the kind of stuff that you get. And to me, it's just as much of a foul as the old crop reports in the Soviet system, which didn't align incentives with behaviors. And when you take the price signal away, I think you've done the most damage you can possibly do. And I that's how I see it at this point. I think price discovery has been destroyed. And I think it's going to be a rough ride to get it back again.
Yeah. And, I just did a video on this the other day, and I don't know if people want to get it back, because I spoke with Jeff Snyder, who's a real good buddy of mine that knows the Eurodollar system better than I think anyone on the planet. And so if you know the Eurodollar system, you know the global monetary system. And it's severely broken. And it was broken in 2008. And if you kind of look into the shadows and look at the data, you can see what really happened. But that destruction of or breaking of the global monetary system, the gap or the void was filled with all of these governments printing money and central banks and taking interest rates down to zero and negative in some cases. And if you think about what's happened as a result, so number one, government power has increased incredibly. Okay. Number two is you have, and I don't want to throw a blanket over all of society, but I know when I was growing up, and this would have been in the 70s and the 80s, the only people understood, or people thought, the only way to get rich was to go out there and work your ass off 80 hours a day, sacrifice everything, and produce a good or service that people want more than the money in their pocket. That's how you get rich. But it focused around work, and it focused around producing a good or service, which at the end of the day is the wealth of the economy or the society. The wealth of the society is not green pieces of paper. It's the goods and services. But anyway, now I think society has come to the conclusion, because of the distortions in the economy from the government and the Fed, that the way you get rich isn't necessarily going out there and working hard, but it's just buy an asset where the price goes up. And I'm going to piss off everybody right now. I think that the people who own Bitcoin have that attitude. I think a lot of people that own gold have that attitude. A lot of the people that own stocks, bonds, commodities, real estate, things that I like, they have this attitude that, well, I'm not going to go out there and work because the cards are stacked against me. So I'm just going to buy XYZ asset and hope it goes up 10 times. And that's how I'm going to get rich. And oh, by the way, it's great because I don't even have to get off my couch anymore. I don't have to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and sacrifice my health and my family life, most likely, and take all this risk with my life savings by going out there and starting a business that could flop after 6 months. And then the third group is these global elites that we've been talking about with the World Economic Forum and the IMF, that are beneficiaries of all of this money printing and the Cantillon effect. And they most likely want to take us into this centrally planned Marxist utopian society. And if we had a solution or a new monetary system, I don't know that anyone would want anything to do with it, because that new monetary system would take us back to the future, if you will, in the sense that we would now have a platform that would allow us to grow sustainably from an economic standpoint, but it would require that we go back to the way it was, where you actually have to produce to consume. And you have to produce in order to increase your purchasing power. And as entrenched as the governments and the global elites, and maybe even some of the participants, as entrenched as their interests are right now, I don't know if that's an attractive option. And therefore, what's the end game? I think you just have, now that we're on a kind of a downward trajectory from the standpoint of producing goods and services, therefore we produce less and less and less. Our economy, by definition, becomes more and more poor. We just go just kind of on this downward trajectory, like Japan more recently, or ancient Rome, until we get to a point where we have to change. The system collapses in on itself. And now we don't have the choice to change, but that choice is thrust upon us whether we like it or not.
Very, very well said. You're reminding me of one of the most brilliant presentations I saw was by Simon Black. He
Yeah.
Sovereign Man fame, and he just gave this presentation once, and just like it was, this guy just spits out brilliance all the time, and he just did it once, and he's like, oh no, I haven't seen it show up anywhere. I would have wrapped the next 10 years of my life around this. Like, oh my God, look at this thing I made. It was that good. And what he had done was he had found a passage from Athens in Greece from when it was going through its own collapse. And he took this passage out of one of the famous historical tomes and took that paragraph and then just wrapped in its modern equivalent. And because what happened was they were just debasing their money, and people's incentives were no longer around producing. Their incentives were around speculating.
Right.
Everything that was happening today had already happened before, and it happened for the same reasons, which was leaders at some point get this crazy idea. They're like, this is easy. If we can just print money, look at all this great stuff that happens, and they get confirmed for a little while, right? But then it falls apart for almost the same reasons always, which is people become incentivized not to work hard. Why should I take risks, George? Why should I take risks if I can just buy Bitcoin, or I'm JP Morgan and I can just rig the gold market a few more weeks? Why would I want to take the time of trying to figure out what people actually want and competing against other people to produce a better widget? That sounds hard and risky, So in many respects, I think, a study of history here is critical, because we're really going through something that's kind of old, kind of new. It's
Right.
new because it's global, but it's kind of old in that we're going to try and have a free lunch and not work and get rich. And it falls apart for the same reasons as always, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. In fact, I had a conversation with Raoul Paul and with Snyder the other day about Bitcoin specifically, because in my mind, I've really been trying to think through whether or not this is a panacea, because from a philosophical standpoint, I want it to be. I want it to be decentralized money, because I think we need that so badly. And that would potentially solve so many problems. And then you look at the blockchain and you look at distributed ledger technology, and you see all these improvements that it can make. But then I kind of went through this thought experiment, and I'm like, okay, I see potential improvements, but in 100 years or maybe 50 years, are we just right back where we are today? And so what I did is I went back and looked at the way the banking system evolved in the United States. So let's just, you go through this quickly. It starts with full reserve banking. So you take your little gold coin or whatever it is, and you give it to the goldsmith, and they store it for you, and they give you a receipt for that. And then maybe, you trade these receipts back and forth with other people, so you don't have to get your gold, because those receipts are just as good as gold, right? And then maybe they lend out a portion of the gold, but it's on a time deposit instead of demand deposit, right? So that's how kind of full reserve works. A lot of people assume that there was no lending under full reserve, but that's not true. You still lend out things, but you just lend out the whatever you're using as money that's in a time deposit. So you're not creating additional money supply by those loans. So anyway, then what happened as a result of the free market? This was not a result of government, but as a result of the free market, we came into fractional reserve banking. And at the time, it was free banking. So most people aren't familiar with that term. Free banking is when it's just all in the private sector. The government, or there's no central bank, there's no government involvement whatsoever. And the individual banks are actually creating their own currency units or their own IOUs for the gold that is on deposit. We actually had this in the United States. All these crazy different, bank notes. And that was a result of the free market. Then what happened is we had the Civil War, and let's say the early 1860s. And so we had national banking. They nationalized everything. Then, of course, in 1913, we had the era of central banking that started. And then we go to 1944, we got Bretton Woods. And as a result of Bretton Woods, we had the global monetary system was created in the sense that the globe and economies outside the United States needed more dollars than we were actually exporting through running a trade deficit. So the solution, I don't want to get too technical, but the solution they came up with was today's Eurodollar system. So my point is, let's go back in time and just assume that you replace gold with Bitcoin. Well, would the same thing not have occurred? Because it was a result of human beings and the actions they took. And I totally get it that most people, they wouldn't need a bank, because instead of having all this cumbersome gold that you have to leave with the institution, you could just have your Bitcoin in your back pocket. So it would be far more decentralized. But is that to say that if we had this system of let's say, Bitcoin lending that was full reserve, the next time that we have a war, the government wouldn't create Bitcoin IOUs? And then now all of a sudden we're back to what in essence is fractional reserve banking. You're creating more currency units above and beyond just the 21 million that is kind of set in stone, because you're creating now these IOUs just like we did with gold. And then you take it to the next step. You look at why we created the Eurodollar system, and do we not get a derivatives market based on Bitcoin? And the whole conclusion was that although Bitcoin and gold may be perfect money, it's owned by imperfect creatures in an imperfect world. Therefore, we cannot expect for perfect money to perform perfectly. That was my conclusion.
Well, I'm maybe even more cynical than you, and maybe I just don't get it. I've gotten into this argument a lot with people. I've decided not to really throw down large on Bitcoin. I know Raoul Pal certainly has. And my reasoning is that if or when the Fed coin, which is coming, comes out and the government decides they don't want it to have competition, which is pretty typical behavior when it comes to money in governments, I think they just shut it down. And the argument is they can't, Chris. They have all these nodes. It's all over the world. I'm like, nah, U.S. Treasury is pretty powerful. If they say to any bank, you may not, if we catch that you've been transacting with anybody who's been transacting with Bitcoin, you're out, no charters, and we bring down the full weight of the law. I think they could be pretty effective at shutting it down personally, but people argue with me about that all the time. What do you think?
I think there's another really good argument that the more adoption it has, the harder it would be to make it illegal, because if it's owned by, let's say, pension funds,
right,
or if it's owned by all these large institutions who, let's say, baby boomers require on for their retirement, I don't know, that would be tough. But to be clear, I think that Bitcoin is a fantastic speculation. I don't see it as insurance, and that's how I see physical gold. So in my portfolio, I have this thing I call it 10-80-10. So 10% would be insurance, physical gold. 10% would be speculative assets that you just think there's good asymmetry there. I think Bitcoin would be a great speculation. And 80% of my portfolio I like to have in what I define as investments, and that's something that pays me to own it. And because there I know it works from the moment I buy it. And as an amateur, I've got a lot of wiggle room there. I'm going to be right more than I'm wrong with something that's just paying me to own it like a rental property. So I want to be clear that I like Bitcoin, but I think it could go to 100,000. I think it could go to 1 million. But I also understand that there's so many variables involved in the future that there's just no way that I think you could predict with above and beyond maybe a 60 or maybe a 70% probability that XYZ is going to play out. And I've heard all of the stories and all the arguments for Bitcoin being a Trojan horse, and it's like a digital cockroach, and you stamp it out over here and it's just going to pop up over there, and you just, no matter what happens, it's going to take over the world. And I get that it's designed that way. I get it. But again, we're imperfect creatures in an imperfect world. And I think you have the next war, you have the next natural disaster, you have something that where let's just say we were using Bitcoin or gold for that matter as global money. And that was it. Well, okay, if you have that, then the next natural disaster, people hoard that. They don't want to lend it out even under a full reserve system, and even if it's decentralized. And you don't think that a government's going to come in and say, okay, well, this doesn't work because now we need to print more currency units to prop up the economy. You think all the Keynesians are just going to go away and just wave the white flag? It's not going to happen. But my point is, I see economics like nature, in the sense that, and it's very weird too, that the same people that argue for climate change admit that, nature, it's just so complex that we can't fiddle with it at all. Because once you fiddle with something over here, it's going to produce this chain reaction. And most likely the outcome is going to be bad. It always goes back to that story of, they have an insect problem in Florida. So they introduce some new frog that is supposed to eat the insect. And then 2 years later, the frog problem is 10 times worse than the insect problem ever was. And then you bring in alligators, and that is an even bigger problem. And it's so easy for the environmentalists to see that. But yet, when they look at the economy, they want everything controlled with central planners. And it's like, no, you're talking about the exact same thing. It's a complex system with billions and billions of variables. So again, my point is, I love Bitcoin as a speculation. I love gold as an insurance policy, but I don't like going and taking 100% of your net worth and putting it into Bitcoin and then maxing out every single credit card to buy gold or Bitcoin or commodities or whatever you think is going to go up in price, because there are just too many variables that as human beings we can't understand.
It's really well said. I'll tell you, I have a bookshelf which has the books that most changed me. Some books make a little dent. I'll tell you one that made a huge dent in me, and it's exactly around this conversation. It's called The Origin of Wealth by Eric Beinhocker. And he talks about the relationship between economics and complexity theory. He welded those together. As soon as I saw it, light bulbs went off. I haven't seen the world the same since, but he has this great recounting of, there's this, the Santa Fe Institute, they bring together all these Nobel laureates, chemistry, physics, So the very first one, they bring in everybody sort of revealing sort of the state of their scientific discipline to everybody else. And the economists get up and they start talking. They have all these complex theories about how they're reaching equilibrium and all this stuff. And the chemists, the physicists, they just lean back and they're like, you have to be kidding me. You are literally using first order calculus, which was developed in 1794 by Walras, this Polish guy, before the second law of thermodynamics had even been resolved. You are seeking equilibrium in a complex system. It doesn't exist. You guys are nuts, right? So anyway, the economists are all chasing. They run back and they spend the next 40 years continuing to pursue that idea that you can achieve equilibrium in a complex system, and you can't. And so we're literally being run by people whose worldview is a fantasy, and it doesn't comport with real stuff. And I think we're getting to the end of that era, right? It's getting awkward. It's really uncomfortable for people because people like, something's wrong, but we can't quite get our fingers on it. And what's happening is they're just throwing more and more and more money and trying to achieve stability in a system where you can just feel it's like the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge. Like there's just something is starting to kick around in all of this. And to me, George, this is the Great Reset's biggest problem, is they're attempting to take old thinking and push it as far as they can into the future, which is, if we can just control all of this, we'll finally achieve that nirvana of stability that's always eluded us. And it will continue to, because it requires energy, requires resources, all these things they don't even think about. In their future, I'll own nothing. I'm going to be happy, and drones are going to deliver whatever I want because I thought it, right? It's just like, that might happen or it might not. And so to me, that 80% of your portfolio is the critical part, because I think, maybe that happens, but if it doesn't, you're really going to want to have tangible physical assets that make sense, that you can make, that you understand. The rest of it, I don't know, you know.
Absolutely. And
So,
I think the easiest way to think about this, it goes back to an analogy that I first heard from my good buddy Peter Schiff. And it just makes so much sense of today's world, where we just see stimulus checks and money printing and $5 trillion deficits, and we get brainwashed to a certain degree in believing that there's actual wealth in the currency. I mean, the MMT people say it all the time, because if you get that green piece of paper, you can go down to the store and actually trade it for some sort of good or service. So we start to believe that that green piece of paper has value. But we forget, and I think Chris Cole says it beautifully, we forget that fiat currency is nothing but a thought abstraction. That's all it is.
yep.
And the only thing that gives it value is that we believe it has value. Once we stop believing, it has no value whatsoever. And going back to Schiff's analogy, if you just ended up on a deserted island, right, and the only thing around you is sand, a couple coconuts, and some salt water, but you had a chest full of $1 billion, would you be rich or would you be poor? Right. So you'd be poor, obviously, because you have no stuff. And it's the stuff that makes us rich. It's not the green pieces of paper. And going back to the Great Reset, all this is doing is reducing the amount of stuff that the global economy produces. And if you're reducing the stuff, you're reducing the wealth of society.
Mm-hmm. That's where it is. So very well said. And we're out of time, but before we run completely out of time, I'm looking at your channel here on YouTube on my other screen. It's phenomenal how much content you have on there. It's really beautifully produced. And everybody go find George Gammon, 2 M's in that last name, Gammon, George Gammon, and check out his channel on YouTube, because you'll find some of the best explanations of all of this stuff. Your passion shows through loud and clear. The quality shows through loud and clear.
Thank you.
As you come, at this point in time, as you look forward, how do I characterize this? What do you think the next year or 2 or 3 years really holds for us in the United States, or as a species? Like, what do you think? Less volatility, the economy comes back, or do we just keep sailing into icebergs here? What do you think's coming up?
No, more volatility. Because you can't, again, let's go back to Chris Cole, and he points out beautifully that you can't destroy volatility, you can only move it. And right now, our economy is built on 3 things: asset prices, debt, and confidence. That's it. And ever increasingly, it revolves around asset prices. So the government and the Fed have to do everything in their power to just keep asset prices elevated, right? Well, as you know, asset prices just don't go up in a straight line. They tend to be volatile. You have bear markets, you have bull markets, you have everything in between. So if you're squashing volatility in asset markets, it has to show up somewhere. So where's it going to show up? It's going to show up in social unrest, because you've got the haves and you've got the have-nots. You've got the people that own assets and the people who do not own assets. I was reading a statistic last night, Chris, and this completely blew me away, that 52% of adults aged 18 to 29 live at home with their parents. I mean, if you would have asked me prior to seeing that statistic what I thought that percentage would be, I would have said maybe 5-10%, maybe. Because I mean, when I was 18, and it wasn't just me. I mean, this was everybody. You're gone. We love you, but there's the front door. Go. You're an adult now. Time for you to just make a life for yourself. That was not an option, regardless of how bad the economy was or how good. It was not an option to stay home. You're an adult. You're 17. You're 18. You're gone. And I cannot believe that 52% of adults in that age group are living home with their parent. Well, my point is that demographic, most likely, they don't own too many assets. And it's just going to get worse and worse for them because the economy, it's like this vicious circle. The economy is dependent upon asset prices going up. But the more asset prices go up, the more social unrest you have within society. So unfortunately, and I hate to say this, but I think that's where the direction we're headed over the next 2 to 3 years is more and more social unrest. So I think it's extremely important for people today to have a plan B. I always say, as an American, you got to have a passport, for heaven's sakes. I mean, that's just an absolute no-brainer. And if you've got one, get two, because I've experienced personally in March and in April that it was very difficult to travel with a U.S. passport. I was actually in the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and St. Bart's, and trying to find some freedom. And it's difficult. So you want, if you have the resources, you want to try to go that direction. But even if you don't, even if you're just the average American, number one, get your passport. But number two, why not think about what you're doing to be more resilient, more anti-fragile? And even if you can't go that far, let's say you live in the suburbs, you've got 2.5 kids, the golden retriever, the white picket fence, the wife, and maybe she's not on board with what we're talking about. She just really doesn't get it. Well, why not just have a little RV in your driveway? It's stocked with food. You got a good mid-1990s diesel truck, the good old-fashioned 7.3 Power Stroke, and you've got it all hooked up. So if it hits the fan, then you can just hop in your RV, grab your kids, grab the dog, grab the wife, and go up to the mountains. Here in Arizona, as an example, head on up to Payson, head on up to Show Love, head up to Snowflake, head up to somewhere where you can just sit back. You got internet connection at your little RV slip, and you can watch whatever happens from a distance, and you're not in the line of fire. And I think at a very worst case scenario, that's what everyone should be doing.
I agree. I love that you put it that way. And by the way, you got to practice that stuff. There's the stuff you think you've watched it on YouTube, but until you actually have to set up the cot out there in the mountains of Arizona and actually get that little stove working, you'd be surprised how much learning there is between what you think you know and what you've done. So I'm a big fan of get the skills. Skills is one of the areas, we talk about 8 forms of capital people can build up, but knowledge is a big one. And for me, knowledge is what you know and what you've done, and it's that overlap, right? And so that's why I'm busy learning. You know how I learned how to raise cows? We got 4 of them, right?
YouTube.
That's how I did it. Now I know more than I did last year, and I still don't know that much. But I think we're kind of built the same, and I think a lot of our listeners are, which is just do it. That's how you get started on something like this. We're having this conversation because one day you said, I'm going to start producing shows, and it's started on real estate, but it ended, it hasn't ended. I mean, it's got you here. And same thing. One day I was sitting down and I said, why doesn't something like the Crash Course exist? I was looking for it. I'm like, why didn't anybody make this? So I made it, right? And that's just, everybody listening to this volatility coming has a lot of uncertainty around it. And I would advise everybody to begin working on those plans and actually working the plans, which means fill up the little RV with a 7.3 Power Stroke diesel attached to the front, but then take it out and give it and use it and practice with it. You got to practice with these things. So that's the advice I have to people is just practice, 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 and persistence. Those are my 4 P's in this story. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, we're going to do this again because obviously we could keep talking for a long time. It's been a fabulous conversation, and I would direct people both to your channel on YouTube. Is there any place else I can direct people to, or is that really where you've got things loaded?
Just that, Twitter, my website, but it's all George Gammon. Like the website's georgegammon.com, Twitter handles George Gammon, Instagram's George Gammon, YouTube channel, all the same.
Great. Fantastic. So George, We'll obviously be posting the links, to all of those down here. But thanks for your time. Great conversation. Let's do it again.
Thanks for having me. Can't wait, Chris.